it's really a huge pleasure to welcome everybody here today, and it's great for obviously for British BII to be really part of Climate Week here in London. It's particularly, I think, important for us today because we're going to talk about a subject over the next couple of hours, which I think is really critical to all of us, and certainly critical to all the people who live in the countries in which we invest. And that is the subject of adaptation and resilience. And as we know that global temperatures will rise. That's an inevitability at this point. It's just a question of how far that will go and how damaging that will be. But we also know that in the countries in which we invest, in our case at BII, the emerging markets in Asia and in Africa, that those are the countries where the individuals living in those countries will be most vulnerable and most affected by climate change. So it's not a question just for us as development finance institutions of addressing the question of mitigation and how we can move and transition to net zero, but it's also critically important that we think about how we can protect people from as I said, the inevitable consequences of some rise in climate change. And the reality is, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, that today we're not doing enough, and we have estimates by the UN that we need about $340 billion a year to be invested in emerging markets in adaptation. We're probably doing today about $46 billion. As a group of DFIs, I think estimates are that of our climate finance, which has now, of course, become a very significant part of everything that we do, but of that climate finance, probably no more than 2% is being invested in climate adaptation. So it's really important that we address this issue. The solutions are going to need to come from the private sector, and that's where we're going to find innovation, and hopefully that's where we'll be able to achieve scale. In BII's case, I think we tried to recognize this issue really initially at Glasgow COP in 2020, and we launched what we called ARIC, which is the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative, and that was really an attempt to try to bring together the DFI community. So as a group, we could build know-how and tools, and also increase our overall exposure to climate adaptation, alongside all the work that we were doing in mitigation. And I think from our perspective, we feel very good about what's been achieved through ARIC, but we also recognise we've got a huge amount more to do, and that's why it's one of the reasons why we're here today, and that's one of the reasons why we are, particularly at BII, why we're focusing on this particular issue. So we're going to have two panels today. The first one is really going to focus on this innovation question, and how can we, as investors, support really transformative businesses that are providing solutions to climate adaptation in the countries in which we're investing. And that today is a very nascent field. There's an enormous amount to do, enormous amount that needs to change in terms of better information, in terms of better access to data, in terms of better access to transactions. But I think what we found at BII is that there is a lot to do. There is a lot of innovation in this space. A lot of it is being done, or certainly a fair amount is being done in our countries, but there is a capital shortage, and there's often an unwillingness of investors to take risk to address or to support opportunities for climate adaptation. That's what we'll be talking about in the first panel, and in the second panel we'll be talking about how we can better manage physical climate rises. So that's the program for today. I am, again, from BII's perspective, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, for attending what is really a very important part of the whole climate debate. We're very fortunate. I'm not going to individually introduce the panelists, but we're very fortunate to have assembled a very distinguished group of panelists. And so I'd like to, from our BII's perspective, welcome you all here.
One by one. So we have Hossam Alam. Hossam is the co-founder, managing partner at Climate Resilient Africa Fund. an early stage venture fund in Africa looking at a range of A&R opportunities there. We also have Jess Ayers, CEO of the Quadrature Climate Foundation. We also have Charissa Bosma, she's the Sustainable Finance Officer at FMO. And we have Laurie Kerr as the CEO of FinDev Canada. So it'd be great if you could come to the panel. Thank you. I think when we were kind of preparing for this, I was very tempted to think about the unsung hero this week of the Climate Week, which is air conditioning. And I was told, well, it should be called sustainable cooling. But yes, that has been on my mind quite a bit. I don't know if it classifies for climate finance, but it surely should. But here we are, and I think I wanted to kind of kick this off by taking a very parallel example of where we are in this precipice of the issues around climate, by taking a very different issue that the world faced with. So about 25 years ago, there were two academics who came up with this really radical but interesting idea that you could actually make money with kind of serving a consumer base that was largely poor people. So essentially, this was the fortune of the bottom of the pyramid, if you may. They said, look, there are 4 billion poor people. They can make great consumers, and only if we work with them can we make this into a great opportunity. A lot of people at that point of time kind of simply rejected the idea. At best, it was with muted kind of skepticism. And how can that happen? It's supposed to be for just the governments to do. It's aid money, etc. But as we've seen, it has become quite an interesting kind of an opportunity now. And so when we think about climate, it is a risk theme if you think about it. It is, it starts off with this fear, this existential fear of things going wrong. And it's interesting to see how investors are kind of going through it. So there is one playbook which says, let's look at it as a risk theme. Let's look at what portfolio risks that we can work with and manage. But there's another set which says this is an opportunity. Let's try to mitigate transition. But that's largely around, I would say, renewable energy, transportation, and we've seen a lot of capital going to that. But we haven't really seen that going into what we call adaptation, resilience. Some of the harder things, some of the more localized issues. And I think that's what we want to kind of get out today, is how do we turn this risk theme into an opportunity theme for investors, both small, large, and how do we kind of do that? So Hossam, I'll turn to you. I mean, A&R, as we call it, is largely, I mean, the opportunities that we see are largely coming from innovative businesses in our markets. They're coming with some great ideas coming from founders, starting newer businesses. So as a venture-focused fund, how do you see that? How do you see such companies kind of growing and at scale? Because ultimately you want to attract follow-on investors as well. So great to get your perspective on that.
Thanks for the question. Thank you to BII for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for showing up. So I think describing our journey for how we identified what to invest in is helpful. When we first set out, we, like you, quickly identified that Africa is not a mitigation story. It's more of an adaptation, resilience story. And the way we saw it is that food systems in particular are among the most vulnerable in Africa. So then we start to ask ourselves questions like, where can you deliver most impact, most adaptation impact within agri-food systems? Oh, when we have identified that opportunity set, you can't really make money off it. Okay, what can you make money off? Oh dear, you can't really measure impact on that. But what can you measure impact on? Oh dear, there's not a very big funnel. So the opportunity set narrows and narrows and narrows, the more you task yourself with wanting to deliver adaptation impact and also delivering returns on investment. So I think it's an important story because the opportunities that will both deliver adaptation impact and scale are that narrow subset of where you can actually make money. I think that the lens will grow. I think the opportunity set that is commercially viable will grow as we invest more and more. Now, as a fund, what we do, we look at agri-food systems across 4 impact horizontals and 5 investment verticals. And so the impact horizontals are things like, how do we arm farmers with digital tools that can ready them for climate shocks? How do we insulate food systems against extreme weather? How can we support crops that are more tolerant to extreme weather? And then once you understand that that's the impact you want to deliver, then you start seeing what investment verticals can you support, can you invest in to intersect with those impacts. And it's things like digital marketplaces, that's a scalable model. It's biotech, those are very scalable technologies. It might be supply chain innovations. I mean, all of you know of cold chain. There's sort of the next generation of cold chain is live chain. How can you deliver shellfish and certain products live into markets? That's an interesting and exciting space. And we also, as a fund, like very much, of course, farming technologies, but also intel, so data that supports farmers in monetizing positive climate action. That is very scalable, right? So these are very venture-backable, scalable technologies that then deliver that impact. There's an ocean of other commercial opportunities that don't build resilience, and there's an ocean of need within the resilience space that isn't commercially viable, but there's that narrow subset, just about enough to support a fund.
That's interesting, and I think what you're doing at a fund level with smaller companies, smaller businesses, trying to get capital behind them, right? So they can grow. And if I may, Laurie, just turning to you, as FinDev, how do you kind of see this? Obviously, when you want to scale this at a much larger kind of from a vision perspective as well, how do you see this particular space evolving from the tools and that you have, but also how do you get others in? How do you kind of mobilize private sector investors who start off pretty skeptical in the beginning? And I'm curious to hear about some of the proof points that you almost want to prove to private investors, and so it would be great to hear how FinDev is thinking about this.
Sure, and thanks so much. And for those of you who may be less familiar, FinDev Canada is Canada's bilateral development finance institution, sort of the Canadian equivalent of BII, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So you talked about you're more in the venture space. Of course, we do private equity, but what I wanted to share a little bit about today, and hopefully I'm not repetitive for those of you who may have been upstairs hearing the pitches earlier today, but one of the initiatives that we're particularly excited about is looking at trying to crowd in larger scale investment into the adaptation and resilience space. And so what we've been working on is a platform. So not a fund, but a platform. And we put together a platform with a commercial bank, with MUFG. The platform is called Gaia. It's a $1.5 billion blended finance platform. It brings together a whole bunch of different actors in the ecosystem. So it brings together sort of public money, GCF money, excuse me, so additional public money, brings together commercial finance, philanthropies into a unique partnership. And what we're really looking to do there is really invest in adaptation. So it's got a 70% adaptation focus. It's not exclusive on adaptation, but a 70% focus. It's focused on 25 emerging market countries, 25 LDCs, 25% LDCs and SIDS within that contingent. So we're really looking to try and open up new channels of finance to types of borrowers that previously weren't accessing commercial finance. We're particularly focused on a different part of the borrower ecosystem, being sub-sovereign, subnationals, cities and municipalities. And I can talk a little bit about the importance of cities in a few minutes if the conversation goes there. But the idea is that we're crowding in very large-scale banks and institutional investors into a platform that isn't a fund. It operates a little bit different to ensure that we're having the scalable impact as well around adaptation and resiliency.
No, that's great, and we will pick up on some of the points you mentioned. I think the point around LDCs and how much of that has to be only for that. Is there a play for middle-income countries for these technologies, but also blended finance? I think great. So when you want to go all hands on deck, Jess, I think this is this is an interesting area because you have obviously a private sector investor. You have DFIs kind of putting their weight in. How else do you think, and where else do you think capital can come from? And your kind of research area and your kind of mandate is an interesting one, and the people you speak with. So it's not just where the money is coming from, but what particular need do you think that kind of capital can help private players there?
Yeah, sure. So For those who don't know, Quadrature Climate Foundation is one of the world's largest climate foundations at the moment, and we are planning significant investment into the adaptation space. So this is quite a live question for us. I'm delighted to be invited onto this panel, so thank you. We think the areas of opportunity for us are twofold. One is around de-risking the actual investment environment, and the second one is de-risking the investments themselves. So around the investment environment, it is very difficult to invest in very vulnerable countries because they are extremely high risk before you even factor in climate impacts. You layer on climate impacts, you then start to look at the way that debts are assessed, and you find a situation where the cost of capital is shooting up. Countries are having to use debt to pay for their adaptation investments. They are spiraling further into debt, which then means that the cost of capital is getting higher and higher and higher. The problem with investable actual opportunities and the window that you were talking about being so small, part of that is that we don't actually know what a good adaptation investment is. You talked about the difficulty in measuring impact. I know that you're going to refer to that after me, so I won't go into it, but there's a real gap in understanding what a good adaptation investment looks like. And then revenue streams are often pitched as avoided losses and kind of almost like charitable contributions rather than actual returnable investment opportunities. So we're trying to help that in two ways. Going backwards, philanthropic capital is obviously wonderful capital. It is high risk, it's patient. We can come into capital stacks, we can come onto platforms like the ones that you're talking about, and we're actively seeking opportunities there to de-risk others' investments. The second thing we can do is actually fund the data and science that goes into new adaptation opportunities. So we'd love to follow up on some of the opportunities there. We are working with groups of farmers, for example, on climate foresights. We're working with women in markets on predicting heat. The third area is looking at the surround sound of some of these investments. So doing better community participation around some of the adaptation investments, building standards, building platforms. And then I suppose the final one is really investing heavily in the storytelling. So people don't know what a good adaptation investment looks like. Everyone couches it as something charitable. We do a hell of a lot of strategic comms in philanthropy. So if we can help change the narrative around what an adaptation investment opportunity looks like, then I think we could go quite a long way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point around the narrative, because I guess that's what even for private investors to kind of think about, the so what about it matters. Charissa, I think you've as FMO has done quite a bit of work, and I think we're collaborating quite a bit on this space and on the climate side. But when we think about measurement, right? When we think about how we think about the mitigation kind of sector, EVs, removing GHG emissions, those are very well understood, relatively. But with climate adaptation solutions, I think that there is a bit of a gap there, and whether it's on measurement or what to measure and how to communicate that. How do you think, what can we do, right, as DFIs to kind of help measure it, communicate it, but also inform investors, such as Hossam and others, to kind of for them to better understand what a good A&R investing strategy is. So we've done quite a bit of work there, so it'd be good to hear and talk to the audience about that.
Great, thank you. And thanks for being here. It's very nice to be here. We indeed work a lot together on the topic. So I think there's a lot for fund managers to navigate, especially fund managers who come newly into this space, I think. And there are many frameworks out there, many different local and international taxonomies. Then there's the risk of greenwashing as well, of course. And we, as a DFI, we get a lot of questions on what is a climate investment and how can we do more in the climate space. And based on all of these questions, BII actually suggested to FMO, hey, maybe we can jointly start working on this. And the outcome of this is a climate investment playbook that we've jointly developed, also with PwC, the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative members have been involved. And we've also had much input from fund manager clients, so that's been very helpful. And the objective of this climate investment playbook is to support fund managers to originate, but also to assess what climate solutions are, what climate investments could look like. And through the playbook, we aim to provide a practical information, but also practical tools on how to do that. And there are multiple challenges. So we try to center them around three different elements, so to say. And I think the first one is the what. So what is a climate investment? So we take a lot of information from all the different taxonomies and frameworks out there and make it relevant for fund managers who are trying to enter the climate space. So we look at key principles there. But the second, also very important, is the why. Why should a fund manager invest in climate? We look a bit at market trends, but more importantly even, we try to answer the question of why on what's in it for a fund manager. Why is it an interesting investment segment? Why is there also a financial opportunity there? So we really look at those kind of elements to answer the why. And then lastly, we also dive into the how, which is of course important because we can think and talk about it, but we also need to get things done. The why investing in climate solutions is also being covered. And we talk about investment strategy there, how to build your investment strategy around the topic of climate, but also on how to integrate it into the investment process. So that's on all the range of the investment process, including including the decision making, the measurement, and of course the origination, which is a very important part. And then there is a part that provides something that I find very important, and that's concrete examples. I think we've mentioned a few already, but I think the concrete examples so far that we've heard about are the very obvious one. And I think then coming back to your point on adaptation, especially on the adaptation and resilience side, we need more examples, and we especially need more examples of cases that do work, that are financially interesting, and that have a good adaptation and resilience impact. So that being said, I think the climate investment playbook, we're bringing to the attention this, and I think there's a big section on adaptation and resilience, including lots of examples, also stressing the business case. Why does it make sense to do this investment from a financial perspective as well as an impact perspective?
That's great. And I think that'll be really interesting for everyone to read. Just as a background, this work was actually jointly done not just by two DFIs. I think it was jointly done by our partners in the ecosystem. And I think these are the people who are really on the ground, talking to companies, really understanding what it means to do some of these hard businesses there. So one of the threads I was picking up was on just some of the risks and how do you get people in. But I'd be really keen to understand, Sam, from yourself, is you mentioned a few of the types of companies that you look at and sectors. Can you kind of give a brief idea of some of the challenges you have? So, for example, scale is a massive challenge. And I think whenever we talk to investors and other LPs, the one question I get back is, can you scale this? I can scale a renewable asset. I can scale, Uber, for example. But how do you scale an A&R investment? Because they have some solutions which will only do drought in one area or for a particular crop. Is that a massive challenge, or is that one of the things you're doing it? And some examples would be great of how you managed to come across that and taken that across geographies.
Yes, it's difficult to scale in Africa because Africa is small. I mean, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but Africa is made up of a lot of relatively small markets. And the problems, as you rightly say, the resilience challenge is often local and sometimes hyperlocal, and so you're solving for narrow set of problems. Now, how replicable is that problem across multiple markets? That's where commercial opportunities start to emerge. But again, back to the earlier point, the opportunity set gets quite narrow if you're solving just for the opportunities that deliver resilience and are scalable, which means that they can go into multiple markets. It's a narrow opportunity set. They exist, but there's so many resilience opportunities that won't meet the commercial threshold. There's another challenge, and that is that very often solving for resilience is not solving one problem, right? The entire value chain is riddled with inefficiencies, and so especially in Africa, which is kind of my focus area, there are inefficiencies up and down the chain. You have to go in and solve for all of them. Life is not so fair that you can just go in and solve one problem and then the whole chain unlocks. You've got to solve for multiple chains, and very often you're solving for one piece with a technology, another piece with a bit of hardware, and a third piece with a human intervention, and you've got to make tech, hardware, and humans work well. These are difficult moving parts to scale, on top of all the other problems. So yes, I mean, it's complicated, but that's why entrepreneurs get paid the big bucks, you know.
That's what keeps me excited, because you know, one of the things we were reflecting before is that when you look at venture capital, the origins of venture capital were hardware, you know, solving breakthrough innovation, you know, the really hard stuff, to a world where now we're, you know, just backing software and you know, a grocery delivery and things like that, which are quite mundane if you look at the issues we have. So, you know, how do we kind of enable players such as yourself to take that risk? And I'm wondering, Jess, if you can kind of throw some light of some of the type of support that you've seen in the past, or you think are possible to help break that bottleneck, you know, prove some proof points.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the business model that we're looking at, and the business models you were just referring to, where you've got an individual solution that works very well in a local space. We can scale those in terms of replicability a bit. And the way that we can help do that in terms of philanthropic capital is, you know, forums for learning, integrating these sorts of solutions into agricultural extension services. That will go so far. I think there are more interesting business models that can bring more scale. So, for example, collective action models, where you might get a group of communities around a tourism area who come together to protect a marine environment because it's of benefit to all. Those kinds of models are starting to emerge, and I think they're quite exciting. And then I think there's the final one really is where private capital is going to fail initially, which is where you need really large-scale adaptation investments. They have to be done by government. But once you get government investing in the infrastructure, that then creates resilience for the communities and the people that sit behind that infrastructure, where private capital can then come in. So it's a challenge, but I think there are some creative ways of thinking about it.
When I think about the internet economy, and well, you know, a lot of the opportunities that you see, it was developed by the defense. So there are a lot of parallels that we're seeing for climate and the issue that we're facing that has already been done with the support of governments. Laurie, any thoughts on how we can kind of further help this through your program? Or
yeah, well, so I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have been said, and also something that I had mentioned, picking up on the sort of the infrastructure piece, because I think that that's really, really important. And if we think about, you know, why are we enabling adaptation? It's not, yes, it's for adaptation and resiliency's sake, but it's also for the benefit of people. And if we take, and where are people? Where are people living? In 1900, London, where we are right now, was the only city on the planet that had more than 5 million people. Today, there's 35 cities that have more than 5 million people. There are 80 cities that have more than 10 million people. 9 out of the 10 largest cities on the planet are in emerging markets and developing economies. I think I'm scribing here. And those 9 cities have between 20 and 30 million people each. 85% of population growth is going to be focused in emerging markets and developing economies. So the people, the actual people, the human beings that we're trying to support through adaptation and resiliency, a vast majority of that is in emerging markets and developing economies. And even though 50% of people now are living in cities, in 2050, when our population grows from 8 billion today to 9.7 billion, again, 85% of which are going to be in emerging markets, 7 out of 10 people are going to be living in cities. So think about the infrastructure needs that are there to support that level of population in urban centers and peri-urban centers, whether it's housing and other buildings, whether it's transport, energy consumption, water, like the infrastructure needs, the adaptation resiliency perspective from infrastructure needs are absolutely huge. And 70% of that infrastructure that's needed is not yet built. So think of the huge opportunity for A&R around that. And that's the opportunity to really affect people's lives going forward in the future, to include that adaptation and resiliency perspective particularly, but not exclusively. There's food systems, there's lots of other things, but infrastructure is really, really huge and really key.
So not just a LDC kind of a problem. I mean, it's both cities everywhere across. You also did kind of allude to, you know, different types of capital, and I'm just wondering, any thoughts around blended finance and how that can support? I mean, we did hear about government and philanthropic support,
Indeed. So most investment, as you had mentioned, most investment in adaptation resiliency is from the public sector heretofore. So about 2% of adaptation investment is from the private sector. So how do we really scale that? And so there is a role for blended finance in that space. And the platform that I had mentioned earlier is benefiting from a blended finance application. And that's really to bridge risks, whether it's risks related to technologies, whether it's risks related to particular markets, particular interventions, to really help meet the private sector where they are, so we're able to mobilize more private sector investment into adaptation and resiliency and provide a bridge to commerciality. At the end of the day, to provide that demonstration effect that there is commercial business models, that there is commercial opportunities in this. So there is a role for blended finance. It depends. It runs a very big spectrum depending on what it is, what type of private sector you're looking to mobilize as well. Because as we know, there is no one private sector. It's a spectrum. We've got sort of the more traditional impact investors on one end that might be willing to take more risks and maybe sacrifice some return to have the demonstrable and measurable environmental, social, adaptation, resilience impacts. We've got more commercial investment in the middle, and then on the other end, we've got institutional investors that are, some of which are bound by fiduciary responsibility, that impact is nice, but that's not necessarily exactly what they're looking for. So we need to make sure that when we're thinking about mobilizing the private sector, what types of private sector are we thinking about? And therefore, the blended finance applications need to be very much tailored to those specific circumstances, again, to provide that demonstration effect, because it's a bridge to somewhere. It's a bridge to commerciality.
Got it. Sam, did you come in or?
No, I totally agree. Blended finance solves a short-term market failure, and once the gap has been stopped, then it should withdraw itself. Otherwise, you're in an unsustainable area. I completely agree.
Great. And Julius, I think one of the questions we wanted to ask is, you touched upon measurement and the things we're trying to do to make it a lot more understandable, if I may, to investors and what they're doing. What has been some of the challenges, even after we measure, that is not kind of percolated across the investor set? The so what question gets asked. A lot of our portfolio companies report, GHG emissions abated, etc. And I have a very skeptical response from some people. Yeah, so what? The business case, if I may, to be as cynical. Are they kind of something that we're moving towards to make it a lot more, dollar denominated, the impact per dollar kind of area?
Yeah, I think overall you do see a trend. I think there are many sort of pressures, of course, moving into this direction. I think one is regulatory pressures. I think reporting pressures that are moving towards this reporting, and I think these are, of course, on one hand, I think things that need to be done. But I think there's also a very good case to make that it actually benefits on the financial side as well, in addition to the impact one. Because I think on the impact side, I think we're all clear. Of course, GHG emissions abated. I think that's really, really helpful. The business case is also, on the other hand, quite clear. What we do see a lot more in the PE and the VC space is that the exit multiples can be higher. There are more companies who want to buy a company that has all these things in place. They're basically more future-proof. So there's a good case to make there as well. And in addition to, I think, the business adding more value to a potential future investment, I also think that for a fund manager, basically the fundraising opportunities in the future will be much better. So I think that on the funding side, there's a big opportunity to say as well for measuring on impact. That having said that, we know it's difficult. I think on the mitigation side, it's a lot easier in many cases than on the adaptation and resilience side. So I think before we get there to a dollar-denominated amount, will be a bit further in the future. But I think there's a big case to make. We know that there's a lot of funding out there, increasing. I think we've heard a lot of examples already this morning. So there's increasing amounts of funding available, and I think it strengthens the company also to be able to report on these things.
Great. And if I can turn to you, Hossam, this is, you have a portfolio now, and you are meeting a lot of these founders, kind of building businesses around A&R. How do you think about that? How do you think about your framework, mental model, if I may, about, impact, business? Are you going to make money? Am I going to see a return? Are people going to come in? So how do you kind of bake that down into your investment judgment? Do you have a framework, a model?
Yeah, I mean, the statement that impact is a sort of guarantor of future success and so on does not honestly resonate so much with me, at least not at the stage of companies that we look at. We seek companies that deliver impact, and we seek companies that, companies have to deliver impact and they have to deliver commercial returns. They have to do both. If one is mutually reinforcing of the other, well and good, but that's not something that we seek. So, I mean, how do we think about impact? We have certain impact themes that we are in search of that are supportive of the investment area that we're looking at, which is agriculture and food systems. And they have to be, they have to be able to scale for commercial reasons and for impact reasons. It's really not more complicated than that. Maybe I misunderstood your question.
No, that's perfect. Any kind of portfolio examples that you want to share about some of these companies which are, hitting it out of the park on both these aspects?
Hitting it out of the park, I'd be jinxing their future success. So let's maybe not go there yet.
You are a VC.
Yeah, I know. No, so we like the insect protein space very, very much. We think it's important for food stability in Africa. We acknowledge that it's probably a part of the animal feed story before human food, even though we do have a insect protein for human consumption company in Ghana. But everything about that business is scalable, highly commercial, it makes very good margins. It can scale not only down the coastline of West Africa, but also into South America and into China. So we're very, very optimistic about its commercial prospects. But from a resilience perspective, the idea of being able to farm such a potent protein under controlled conditions, regardless of what the weather outside is doing, to produce a food that potentially substitutes animal or mammal meat and milk, which comes with its own climate, nightmare, is very kind of mutually reinforcing, very sustainable. Sustainable is the wrong word because sustainable now means so many other things. But it is a climate resilient food source at a very important time for Africa, when Africa is hemorrhaging hard currency needs, importing animal feed and protein and so on. So that's an example of how we're able to check both boxes.
That's great.
I wanted to come back into the kind of this opportunity and like just the opportunity set around this. So there's plenty of risks associated why adaptation resiliency is necessary. But if we really look at the opportunity, they say that there's only two certain things in life, death and taxes, right? Well, I would say adaptation is a certainty now, because the fact is, like Bloomberg, so BNEF just came out with their 2024 New Energy Outlook, and their economic transition scenario is 1.75, and then the net zero scenario. So even in their transition scenario is 1.75. So the fact of the matter is that there is the world, it is changing. It is adaptation is a case for now, and it is a case for the future. It's not going to go away. So the opportunity set is absolutely there. Again, death, taxes, and adaptation. It's there. It's not going back, regardless if we hit 1.5, 1.75, or forbid anything more than that. But adaptation is real now and a huge opportunity going forward.
Yeah, and before I move on to some of the questions, some really interesting questions we're getting. And I think people in the UK have been thinking about this for a very long time. It's the very reason we talk about the weather so much. We're very conscious of it. But if you can get some questions that are coming online.
Sure, I can maybe bundle a couple of them together for the panel if that's helpful. So firstly, we have seen a shift in private attitudes towards mitigation investments as commercially attractive. Do you see this happening in the adaptation space as well? And then secondly, with commercially driven adaptation funds and platforms, how do you ensure that the mandate encourages sufficient risk-taking and commitments, especially given that previous efforts in this space have focused on technology transfer, investing in developed countries, but this seems to only have limited success and relevance in the global south? So two questions there, one on relevance of adaptation finance and then on this technology transfer question.
I think Laurie, the second one seems very directed towards you, so it'd be great if you can pick that up. And then
I was writing the first one down. Could you repeat the second one? I'm sorry.
So with commercially driven adaptation funds and platforms, how do you ensure that the mandate encourages sufficient risk-taking and commitments?
Well, so that, I mean, that's the entire purpose of putting together a platform that uses blended finance to encourage private investment in areas where there is a lack. So again, coming to the point that you made, and that impact is required but not sufficient, commercial returns are absolutely required as well. And so trying to crowd in private capital to be able to make investments that they haven't been able to, that's what's enabled through blended finance. And again, through the sort of the unique partnership between commercial and DFI and philanthropy on the side, we're ensuring that the impact is there. There is a business case to be made, but it takes time. There's a sort of a short-termism as well. Investment in adaptation resiliency in some circumstances is more of a longer-term effort. So to be able to show those returns over time, there has to be that sort of enabling framework around it. I would say that one of the challenges, one of the additional challenges that emerging markets and developing economies face that developed markets don't, is the fact that there are higher real and perceived risks in emerging markets, right? I mean, there's things that have nothing to do with what needs to be done, the legal, regulatory policy, institutional environment to support investments aligned with NDCs and NAPs and things like that at the country level. And that's regardless of whatever country you're in. But in addition, emerging markets and developing economies, there's different issues around macroeconomic stability, political stability, foreign exchange, all of those things that, regardless if it's low carbon, climate resilient, need to be addressed as well. So there's also addressing some of those risk perceptions, I would say, to a certain degree, as well as higher real risks in certain circumstances as well. But that's what blended finance is helping to enable. So it's kind of a twofold benefit.
Great. I think the first question, if you get Jess, you or Carissa to kind of talk through.
I actually wrote down the second question. Can I come in on the second question?
Yes, please.
Sorry. One of the things we haven't talked about when we talk about managing risk is the fact that there is one financial instrument that loves risk, and that's insurance. So there's a massive opportunity here for scaling up insurance, and we're doing some work with an organisation called Climate Resilience for All, which has set up a heat-triggered insurance mechanism where once the temperature goes over, I can't remember whether it's 46 or 47 degrees, there are payouts to women at markets to help them avoid losses that they experience from food waste. Now, at the moment, that's philanthropically backed, but or subsidised, I should say. But it is paid for by the individual consumers as well. There's a massive social protection opportunity there. There is a massive opportunity for bilaterals to come in. I think they might already be coming into that particular programme. So if you flip risk on its head, there's still a massive opportunity for private finance if we just think about the instruments that we're using.
And therein lies the structure that we've been talking about, because we're following that very closely. That's backed by philanthropy. Then there could be a different type of blending, ultimately, to have commercial insurance available. So it's that proof of concept, that's demonstration of fact, that's happening with this pilot in India right now.
Yeah.
That's great. Yes, maybe the first question should be repeated.
To what extent do you see private investor perceptions changing in relation to adaptation investments in the same way that we've seen with mitigation finance?
I'm happy to come in from a philanthropic perspective. It's been quite interesting that actually climate funders have been quite late to the party on adaptation, which is fascinating, because if we think about why philanthropists care about climate, they care about climate because they care about human suffering. And somehow, somewhere along the way, we all decided that prevention was better than cure. Suddenly, we're seeing philanthropy pour into the adaptation space, partly because it's just, death taxes and adaptation is something that I will be using going forward. So there are tragic reasons for that, but there's also some quite active convening going on now amongst all the philanthropies who are working on climate to actually kind of wake up to the human suffering that's being driven. So I'd say the philanthropy capital is set to scale massively in this space over the coming year. It already is.
I think there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, depending on where you're coming from. If you're like a technology provider or a sort of looking at innovative proteins or something like that, that's one part of the spectrum. Another part, unfortunately, does go, I think, to you said, maybe it was you that said about avoided costs, right? So it depends on what part of the ecosystem around adaptation and resilience you're thinking about. And in some cases, when it comes to adaptation and resilience, the language is actually a barrier, right? And those of us who are in this space, we have a certain language around speaking like this. But when you go to the actual corporate or bank or farmer or what have you, like they're not speaking the same language. So actually having that ability to translate, to show the impact, to show that there's a business case, whatever that business case is really, really important. We're about a decade behind, I would say, where we were a decade ago with mitigation, right? And as you had sort of said, mitigate, like we get it now. Everybody kind of understands that now. Adaptation resilience is a little bit further behind. And so we're kind of going up that curve, but making it understanding what it means as not just a business opportunity, but importantly, I think, as an avoided cost. I don't think we should or could discount that from the way that investors are thinking about it.
Great.
Yeah, I fully agree with what has been said, and I think on the funding side, you definitely see a lot more funding becoming available, all types of funding. I think being here at London Climate Action Week, I think I've heard so many new proposals, so many new funding coming in. So I think on the funding side, there's a lot happening. So I would say there's definitely some kind of a shift visible. Similarly, I think on the opportunity side, I do think, sadly enough, the extreme and more severe weather events that we've been experiencing and that we for sure will experience in the future do help with creating these more opportunities as well. Rather unfortunate. But I do see that this is definitely happening. And I think it probably won't ever go as fast as the renewable energy shift. I think that one was particularly fast. And I think here adaptation and resilience will always be context specific. We've already highlighted some of the challenges there. But I do see a shift, and I think it does make me quite optimistic that we're in any case moving in the right direction.
That's great. I think we'll have a round of questions from the room as well.
Hi, thank you. I'm Rachel Zara from FSD Africa Investments. And we are an anchor in the craft vehicle. You talk about a lot of funding being available, but the reality is a lot of these innovations and ideas are going to come from the smaller companies that are really, one, being pioneer in testing new technology, and so are quite risky. And so where is that funding coming? I don't see craft, maybe Hassam has news for us, but we're really trying to support some of these smaller ventures on the continent that are coming up with these solutions. You've got other funds that are also struggling to raise capital. So where is that money going? And how do you ensure, particularly on the African continent, that you are backing the entrepreneurs and the innovations that are coming from the African entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very, very good point. What we do see that there is a lot of funding available. It doesn't always reach, I think, the right entities or the entities that we would want it to reach. There is a big gap of bankability, basically. I do think there's a lot more that we should all jointly do. Because I think indeed a lot of the funding that is available ends up with entities that require a large amount of funding and maybe not indeed the type of innovative solutions that require small amounts of funding. So I think especially those are very challenging. For them it's very challenging to get funding. And I think there are multiple potential solutions, but they're all challenging. And I think they all require a lot of effort, a lot of partnerships as well. So I think there's a lot of work for us jointly to do also on trying to bridge this gap, this basically of the entities, the companies that we are not managing to reach, for instance, as an DFI. I think one of the things that we do is also We've started investing in venture capital, sometimes also through venture capital funds. I think that's one way. But I think I mentioned it already, but partnerships can also be very important. We also try to work with other partners. For instance, FMO is partnering with WWF and a Dutch NGO called SNV, whereby we're jointly trying to help companies that may not be fully bankable. And when I say bankable, I mean it from a DFI perspective. Bankable from our point of view to get them to a level where they are and where they could receive money from, for instance, us and potentially other investors as well. So we do fully recognize that sometimes there is a big gap of projects that can get funding and do not get funding. So I think that's definitely something that we should all try to bridge this gap, basically.
So yeah, go team CRAF.
But can I make a comment around this as well? And thanks for your question, Anne-Marie. But I actually I don't think mitigation is easier than adaptation. I think mitigation is bloody difficult as well, right? I mean, there's a very wide suite of mitigation opportunities out there, but we have collectively been spoiled by renewable energy, right? Renewable energy, sorry, with utmost respect to organizations that have done Herculean work in the renewable energy space, it's quite easy. Right? You stick hardware in the ground, it produces energy, there's a demand for it, it's cheaper than the alternative. Let's not kid ourselves. People didn't invest in renewable energy for climate reasons. They invested in it because it's the next cheap fuel source, right? There was demand for it. But there are many other mitigation solutions out there that are not being pursued, including soil capture, forestry capture, direct air capture, minerals capture. I mean, there's a lot of solutions out there that don't work yet, and that's also mitigation finance. So I think it's wrong to characterize mitigation as having an economic profile, because it doesn't, right? There are individual projects that have an economic profile. Renewable is one, electric vehicles is another. Those are economic profile projects, and those rightly took off because there's huge demand, it's suddenly commercially viable, so we all ran in after that. And then called mitigation easy, and adaptation is now, no, it's all difficult. I think that collectively the capital world needs to raise its expectation of the riskiness. We need to have higher risk tolerance for this space and realize it's difficult and that not everything is going to be at the scale or the ease of renewable energy and EV. And we just have to get to work, right? Just got to do the work and yeah, sometimes throw money at the problem and wait for the solutions to come out.
Hi, this is Mark Napier, also from FSD Africa. But I just wanted to say, for me, the issue is one of scale. And I think what we see when talking about the development of a market, which is what we're really talking about here, is that it's very, it's sometimes very easy to go broad and to start exploring very innovative things on frontiers and so on. And I would say, insects would fall into that category. And that's really important because these are the pathways to the future. But there's also a near-term need for depth as well. So getting the money into parts of the market, and we're talking in this case about the adaptation space, that can absorb significant amounts of capital, because that's what's going to also drive the development of the economies that we care about as well. So and really the elephant in the room here, or the missing piece, is equity for project development, equity or grant funding for project developments at the sort of for large scale projects. And Laurie, I really like what you said about cities and urban developments. I think this is where we need to focus, because I think that's where we can start to create some viable projects that will absorb capital at scale. I think a number of us might have been in a meeting earlier in the week with CPI and PIDGE, where they were talking about, they were saying that if you're really serious about wanting to boost investment in resilience, then infrastructure is the place to go, right? So let's just build resilient infrastructure, and think about all the incentives that you need to work with governments on, for example, tax and so on and so forth, in order to drive that large-scale investment. But the starting point is always equity in project development.
Any? Yeah, please.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Peter Boonman. I'm from SNV, and for full disclosure, we are one of the origination partners in the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development with FMO and climate fund managers. The biggest engine for jobs and workforce in developing countries are the SMEs, and we'd like to see more money go there. At the same time, I know there's institutional investors who would like to get into the act, who, by the way, sometimes say that the development finance institutions are taking too much the senior positions and basically stay there and invest to hold. So how do we create much more of a market that allows more investment to go to indeed the SMEs, smallholder farmers and the likes? So it's the development of the marketplace.
Yep.
So, I mean, there's several different ways, and sort of generalizing across sort of the MDB, DFI universe. There's sort of several channels to market to support SMEs, because you're exactly right. They're the backbone of well, developed markets and emerging markets and developing economies. So one way are working with local financial actors, right? Whether it's VC, whether it's PE, whether it's local or regional banks, but working with those who are on the ground, taking advantage of that capillarity to get to get to capital to where it's needed most in the SMEs through cooperatives, for example, to farmers. So working with local financial actors is really, really important. Some of the other ways would be working through kind of aggregation platforms as well, right? Because we, again, have to understand the fact that an institutional investor is not going to make $1 million investment in an SME. It's just not going to happen, and that's okay. So how do we create other types of intermediation such that we could tap the deeper pockets through an intermediary to be able to go through? So in the case of adaptation, this is what we're doing in the platform that I had mentioned. But it's about getting to scale. It's about diversifying risks, et cetera. But there's many, many channels to market. And I also, one thing that we talk about a lot in the sort of the broader DFI space is about mobilizing international capital. There's a lot of domestic capital that also is idle and needs to be mobilized, and that's really, really important as well. So we can't just focus on international capital. It's really about domestic mobilization as well.
And that's really important, because you want people who are getting locally affected as well, to face the heat. But I think we're at time, and again, thank you for the questions. We've had a really interesting discussion. I just want to kind of try to summarize some of the discussion points. I think we heard some really interesting examples of A&R businesses and how scalable they can be, but the kind of capital they'll need to require, but also how others can actually come in and support that, other forms of capital. And this whole concept of, you need a capital stack almost. You need an equity, debt, blended finance. You need all of these to come in, but you need other players as well. It's just not only private sector, not just only governments. So you need, the whole village to come in. But it's also interesting of, how you need to design larger platforms to get further funds, people into that, because you can have a DFI-led approach as we do, direct investments through funds, through debt, blended finance, but the concept of the platform is really interesting, because you can get people at scale into the same things that you're doing. We've also touched upon some of the barriers that we have. I think to your point, Hussam, on the fact that nothing is easy, and ultimately you have to have something which is you have to have a lot of kind of effort doing this. That's important. But I think what we're seriously, one consistent message is collaboration, the need for sharing insights, the need to share what exactly are we solving, to kind of simplify this A&R world to people is very important. I mean, we face that when we explain A&R to a hedge fund trying to invest in our markets, and they have zero clue of what that is. But when you take them through examples, they're like, I get it. It's a bit like this, and So I think it's that. I'm not saying we should oversimplify things, but it is a real problem. And Laurie, debt, taxes, and adaptation is probably It's probably what's going to stick on that. So on that cheery note, thank you, everyone for attending, and hope you have a great set of session after. Thank you.